The marshal arrived at 7:15, earlier than Marisol had expected, though she had known since Thursday that he was coming. She heard the elevator at the end of the fourth-floor hallway groan to a stop, and she sat up from where she'd been lying on top of the covers, still dressed in her coat, Cora asleep against her side with both knees pulled to her chest and her hands tucked beneath her cheek. The 22 boxes were already packed and sealed, stacked along the living room wall in rows 3 and 4 deep, each one labeled in black marker with the room it had come from, even though there would be no rooms to match the labels for a while. She had packed quickly over the preceding 3 days, the way she did most difficult things, without stopping long enough to feel any single part of it too much. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. The knock came hard. Official. The kind of knock that has no interest in your answer. Marisol smoothed Cora's hair once before standing. Her daughter stirred, but didn't wake, and she was grateful for that. She went to the door and opened it before he could knock again. He was a large man in his 50s, tired around the eyes, with reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead and a clipboard tucked under his arm. He had a younger officer with him, a woman who kept her eyes on the floor. Neither of them looked cruel. They looked the way people looked when they had a job to do that they would rather not do. He said her name as a question, even though he clearly already knew it. She confirmed it. He handed her the notice of eviction she had already received twice in the mail and told her she had until noon to remove her belongings. A city moving truck was available through a program, he said. She could call the number at the bottom of the form. She thanked him. That part surprised him. She could see it in the brief softening around his eyes. He said he was sorry. She said she knew and closed the door. In the kitchen, she made coffee from the last of the canister and sat at the table in the apartment she had lived in for 6 years. The lease had been in her name alone since the beginning. She had brought Cora home from the hospital to this apartment when Cora was 4 days old, and it was the only home her daughter had ever known. The walls by the kitchen door frame still had pencil marks where Marisol had recorded Cora's height every birthday. The lowest mark at 2 years old, when she had been not quite 3 feet tall, and had been furious about it. The highest at 8 3/4 when Cora had stood very straight and announced she was sure she had grown a full inch since the summer. The marks could not come with them. She sat and looked at those marks for a long time and drank her coffee and did not cry, which was a decision she had made the night before, practical and firm. Marisol Vega had come to New York from Salinas, California, at 22 with a nursing certification, a duffel bag, and the conviction that a life could be built from scratch if you were willing to approach the work without sentimentality. She had been raised by her grandmother in a house that was always slightly too small and perpetually warm, where the kitchen carried cumin and dried chiles for morning and the television ran in Spanish until Abuela Consuelo fell asleep in her chair. Her grandmother had been the stable center of a childhood that moved around frequently, following her mother's various circumstances, and by the time Marisol was 12 she had understood that stability was something you made rather than found. She had gotten her nursing certification through a community college program she paid for by working nights at a grocery store. She had done this without complaint and without drama, the way she did everything, and she had done it well. New York had been the logical destination because it had the largest concentration of healthcare work, and because she knew no one there, which she had considered an advantage rather than a liability. She had been 22 and practical in a way that sometimes made other 22-year-olds uncomfortable. The city had not been kind to her in any obvious sense. It was expensive in every direction, and the nursing work that had seemed straightforward from California paid less than projected once rent and transportation and daycare were factored. She had worked for 3 years as a home health aide, caring for elderly and disabled patients in apartments across Upper Manhattan and the Bronx, cycling between clients on the subway with her bag of supplies. She was good at the work. She had a quality of steadiness that people in pain found calming, an ability to be present without being intrusive, and she noticed what was needed before it was requested, which was the most useful skill a person in her position could have. Cora's father had been in her life for 11 months. He had not been a bad person. He had wanted something different from what she had, and he had said so clearly when Cora was 3 months old, and she had appreciated the clarity even as the leaving had opened something in her chest that had taken a long time to close properly. She did not spend time cataloging what might have been different. That kind of accounting did not lead anywhere useful. She had raised Cora alone since then, and she had done it with the same methodical care she brought to every long project. The budget discipline that had carried her through community college carried her through this too. She kept a ledger in a spiral notebook, income on the left page and expenses on the right, and she was precise about it in the way that people are precise about things when there is no margin for imprecision. She bought groceries on sale, used apps for coupons, purchased Cora's clothes at consignment shops, and washed them 3 times before her daughter wore them, so they smelled like their detergent instead of someone else's life. She had kept the apartment for 6 years because the rent was stabilized, and because she was the kind of tenant landlords thanked in the hallway, reliable and quiet and never a problem. What she had not been was lonely, which sometimes surprised her when she thought about it. She had Cora, who was unusually good company for a small person and who had, from a very young age, treated the world as a source of information rather than entertainment, approaching everything with a researcher's patience. She had her work, which was demanding enough to fill the hours that might otherwise have gone to regret. She had Abuela Consuelo on the phone every Sunday evening, her grandmother now in her late 80s and living with Marisol's cousin in Salinas, but sharp and interested and full of opinions about everything Marisol told her. The life she had built was not the life she had imagined at 22. It was smaller in some dimensions and fuller in others, and she had learned to measure it by what it was rather than by what it wasn't. The building's sale had started the trouble. New owners, new calculations. The stabilization protections had been challenged through a legal process Marisol had not understood until it was nearly finished, and by the time she retained a tenants' rights attorney through a legal aid clinic, the clock had already run close to its end. The attorney had been capable and thorough and had done everything available to her. The clock had run out anyway, so there were 22 boxes, and a marshal at the door, and a daughter who would wake up to learn that the only home she had ever known was no longer theirs. Cora woke at 8:30 in the way she always did, gradually and with a kind of deliberate reconnaissance, as if waking required first assessing what kind of morning it was likely to be before committing to it. She lay still for a moment, then sat up and looked at the boxes stacked along the wall, and then at her mother, and the understanding that crossed her face was the kind children develop earlier than anyone hopes they will need. "Can we eat first?" she said. They could. Marisol had kept oatmeal and orange juice back from the packed boxes. She made it the way Cora liked it, with brown sugar and a little cinnamon, and they ate at the kitchen table together. Cora ate steadily and asked practical questions. Where would they sleep tonight? Would her school stay the same? What happened to things when they went into storage? Marisol answered each one directly. A shelter, she said, for right now, but not for long. Yes, the school would stay the same for the rest of the year. The things stayed in the storage unit until she found somewhere new, and then they would come out again. Cora absorbed this. She put her spoon in her empty bowl with a small clink. Okay, she said. That word from her daughter, spoken in that particular tone, settled and free of self-pity, nearly broke something in Marisol at the table. The equanimity of it. The 8-year-old decision that okay was the right response even to this. She pressed her thumbnail hard into her palm beneath the table until the feeling passed, then smiled at Cora and said they should get started. The city truck came at 10. 2 men worked efficiently and without conversation. Marisol and Cora carried smaller items down themselves, back and forth in the groaning elevator, and by noon the apartment was empty. The pencil marks on the doorframe were the last thing she looked at before she pulled the door shut and handed the keys to the marshal. The shelter was in the Bronx, a converted church hall with cots in rows under fluorescent lighting that hummed at a frequency designed, it seemed, to make thinking difficult. It was clean. The staff were professional and neither pitying nor indifferent, which was the correct tone. There were other families, other children, and Cora observed them with the measuring attention she brought to unfamiliar situations, cataloging, and filing. They were given 2 cots side by side. Marisol arranged their bags in the narrow space between the cots and the wall, put Cora's stuffed dog on her pillow, stacked her library books beside it. Cora spent the evening reading with the same focused quiet she brought to reading anywhere, as if the cot and the fluorescent light and the surrounding murmur of other people's lives were simply the current conditions, and conditions were not the point. She asked once whether there would be oatmeal in the morning. Marisol said she believed so. Cora nodded and went back to her book. There were 14 other families in the shelter that first night. Marisol could hear their specific sounds: a baby fussing 3 rows over, a man on a phone call at the far end of the hall speaking in low, urgent Spanish, a girl about Cora's age who sat on her cot folding and unfolding a piece of notebook paper into shapes that kept not working out. The fluorescent lights stayed on at reduced brightness through the night, never fully dark, which was a policy Marisol understood and Cora seemed not to notice at all. Marisol sat on her own cot after Cora fell asleep and opened the old laptop she had carried through every stage of the move, the 12-year-old machine that ran slowly but ran, and she returned to the email she had now read 4 times without deciding what to do about it. It had come from an attorney in a town called Greer's Hollow in upstate New York. The attorney's name was Gerald Hatch. He wrote in careful, slightly formal language that he was contacting her on behalf of the estate of Rosa Elena Vega, deceased, and that she, Marisol, was named as the primary beneficiary. Rosa Elena Vega had been the younger sister of Consuelo Vega, who was Marisol's grandmother. Abuela. Consuelo had mentioned a sister Rosa perhaps 3 times over the course of Marisol's whole childhood, always vaguely, as a sister who had gone east when they were very young and eventually stopped writing. Marisol had assumed she was dead. She had been alive, it turned out, until 9 weeks ago, dying at 91 at a county hospital near Greer's Hollow. The estate Rosa had left her consisted of a property called, in county records, the Harlow parcel. It sat on 112 acres in a township in the Catskills and included a main house of approximately 14,000 square feet, several outbuildings, an orchard of about 30 trees, and a half-mile of creek running along the eastern boundary. Rosa Elena Vega had lived and worked on this property since 1961, employed initially as a housekeeper by the owner, a man named Cecil Harlow, and continuing as sole caretaker of the property after Harlow's death in 1978. Harlow had died with no children and no contested heirs. He had left the estate and all its contents to Rosa in a handwritten instrument filed with the county clerk in October of 1977, apparently written with the knowledge that his health would not last through the following year. He had been correct. Rosa had inherited the property at 47 years old and had continued living in the small caretaker's cottage on the grounds, maintaining the main house in whatever way her resources allowed, without moving into it or making any public claim to its contents. She had paid the property taxes every year for 4 decades. Gerald Hatch's letter included a record of these payments. They were modest because the county assessment was modest, given the property's condition, but they were consistent, coming each year from an account containing only what Rosa's Social Security and a small county senior program provided. How she had managed this without ever drawing on the property itself as a resource, Hatch's letter did not fully explain. She had updated her will in 2019. The estate and all contents went to Marisol Vega, granddaughter of her sister Consuelo, described in the will as the most sensible of the next generation, which was all Rosa had apparently been able to determine about her from a distance, and which Rosa had found sufficient. To claim the property, Marisol needed to pay an outstanding tax lien of $100 and present identification to Gerald Hatch's office. She read the email a 5th time. She tried to think about it clearly, which was her default approach to everything. The house, as described, was almost certainly a disaster. 14,000 square feet uninhabited in any real sense for over 40 years, maintained by a woman who had been 91 years old and working with limited money. The roof could be failed. The plumbing could be a ruin. There was no certainty that anything in the building still functioned. She looked at her daughter asleep on the shelter cot with her stuffed dog under her arm, and she looked at the fluorescent light overhead and the rows of other cots and the gray institutional walls of the converted church hall. She bought the bus ticket. The bus let her off on a county road 14 miles from Greer's Hollow early on a Wednesday morning. A mechanic at the gas station at the bus stop drove her the 14 miles without being asked, in the way that people in small towns sometimes do things without being asked, because it was cold and she was clearly not from there, and he was going to town anyway. He asked no questions, and she offered the sparse detail that she was there about an inheritance, and he nodded as though this were not particularly unusual and turned the radio to a country station for the rest of the drive. Gerald Hatch's office was on the 2nd floor of a hardware store, reached by an exterior staircase that rattled under her boots. He was in his 70s, compact and deliberate, with a handshake that communicated both assessment and conclusion simultaneously. He had been Rosa's attorney since 1993. He spoke about her with the specific warmth of someone who had genuinely liked a client and was allowing himself this once, in the right circumstances, to say so. She was a person of absolute consistency, he said. Whatever she said she would do, she did. When she came to me in 2019 to update her documents, she told me she had been looking for the right person for a long time, and that she believed she had found one. He pushed a thin manila folder across his desk. He had done some of his own looking, he said, to satisfy his professional due diligence. Inside the folder were printouts. A Facebook page she had mostly forgotten after making it, a LinkedIn profile from a job application years ago, a photograph from a community health fair she had organized in her building in Queens 2 winters before, and a short piece in a local paper about a tenant assistance drive she had helped coordinate. Rosa had assembled these from a distance, reading them on whatever screen was available to a woman of 90-something in a rural county, and had drawn conclusions. The tax lien was $100. Marisol paid it in cash. Hatch filed the paperwork in the time it took her to drink a cup of coffee he had offered, and she had accepted gratefully. He handed her a deed and a ring of keys, more keys than she had expected. 17 keys, each one labeled in tape with careful handwriting she could see at a glance was old and very deliberate. Front door, back door, cellar, workshop, upper storage, and several others with labels she didn't yet have context for. He drove her out to the property himself, saying he had been meaning to see it properly for years and had never quite arranged it. They went 12 miles on a county road through a landscape that was entirely bare-limbed trees and frozen fields, and the occasional farm building set back from the road at a distance that suggested the people who built it had wanted space between themselves and everything else. Then they turned onto a track that thinned to gravel and began to climb, going through a gap in a long stone wall where iron gates stood permanently open, rusted into position at a wide angle that let them through without slowing. The track continued through fields that had gone entirely to goldenrod and sumac and the occasional wild apple tree still bearing a few blackened fruits, and then dipped into a stand of mature hemlocks before opening again, and the house appeared through the bare trees at the far side of the cleared ground. Hatch let the truck roll to a stop and left the engine running. He sat looking at the house for a moment without speaking, which Marisol appreciated. She needed a moment with it herself. Marisol had prepared herself on the bus for something that would require serious work. 14,000 square feet, for decades of minimal maintenance, one elderly caretaker. She had assembled a mental picture of something that would need enormous investment to make safe, let alone livable, something that would be a long process before it was a solution. She had prepared for this deliberately so that she would not be caught off guard by what she saw. The house was worse than her mental picture and also, in some qualities she could not immediately name, different from what she had feared. Worse because the covered porch wrapping around the front and east face of the building had collapsed in 2 sections, leaving debris across the approach and the front entrance accessible only by stepping over what had fallen. Worse because the window on the northwest corner of the 3rd floor was entirely gone, the frame warped and dark, open to weather, with water stains reaching down the exterior brick below it in long brown shadows that told a multi-year story. Worse because the grounds had gone entirely to nature, the formal structure of whatever gardens had once been there lost under decades of growth, and because the fieldstone chimney on the east face had lost its upper section, the fallen stones lying in a heap in the dead grass below. But the bones were different from what she had feared. The foundation and the first story of the building were granite, a gray-brown stone cut, and laid with a precision that suggested it had been built by people who intended it to stand for several generations. Above the granite, pale yellow brick had weathered to a muted color that was not unpleasant. The lines of the building were clean and deliberate, not ornate beyond what was structural. 3 full stories on the main section, with a 4th-story turret room on the southwest corner that still had its diamond-paned windows intact, the old glass throwing fractured afternoon light in small pieces across the dead grass of the near garden. Whatever Harlow had been, he had built to outlast himself. The walls were sound. Hatch confirmed this by walking the perimeter with her and pressing his palms against the stone at intervals with the calm of someone who grew up around old buildings. The foundation was solid. The deferred maintenance was real, but it was surface, he said. Mostly surface. given what it could have been. She stood looking at the house for a long time before she said anything. Then she called Cora at the shelter on the prepaid phone and told her she would be back by 10 that night, and that she had something to show her. 2 days later, they arrived together on the county bus, getting off at the end of the gravel track and walking the quarter-mile to the house with 2 rolling suitcases, 2 backpacks, and a canvas bag of cleaning supplies. The morning was gray and very cold, the kind of cold that comes from the sky rather than the wind, flat, and even in all directions. Cora walked beside her mother without speaking, which was how she walked when she was observing something carefully enough that language would interrupt the process. Marisol watched her daughter's face as the house came into view through the bare trees. Cora stopped walking. She stood with her suitcase handle in both hands and looked at the building for a full 30 seconds, moving her gaze from the collapsed porch sections to the intact turret windows to the dark opening where the northwest window should have been to the chimney rubble in the dead grass below the east wall. Then she looked at her mother. "Are we going to live in that?" Cora said. Her voice was not afraid. It was a voice doing honest inventory. "We're going to fix it and live in it," Marisol said. Cora considered this. "Okay," she said, and began walking again. Getting through the front entrance required stepping over the collapsed porch section, which Marisol did first, and then helped Cora across, lifting her by the waist over the worst of the debris. The front door was heavy old oak that had swelled in its frame, and she had to lean into it with her shoulder before the hinges gave. It swung inward with a sound that was both complaint and concession. The smell was the first thing. Decades of accumulated stillness, something between cold stone and old wood, and the faint sweetness of plaster that had cycled through too many seasons of moisture and drying. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was simply the smell of a building that had been waiting. The entry hall ran 30 feet from the front door to a wide staircase at its end. The floors were wide plank oak, gray with years of dust, but when Marisol crouched and pressed her thumb into the wood at its edge, she felt solid grain beneath the surface accumulation. The ceiling above was pressed tin, a pattern of overlapping circles, centered on a medallion around a hook where a chandelier had once hung. The walls were plaster, marked in places with old water stains from the failed window and the roof, but intact. Doors stood closed on both sides of the hall. The staircase was wide, with a carved newel post and balusters that had been a point of considerable pride for whoever built them, given the detail worked. Into the wood. They moved through the ground floor slowly, Marisol pushing open each door and standing in each doorway to assess what the room would require before they stepped inside. A parlor with the wallpaper coming off and long strips from walls that held their plaster shape underneath. A dining room with a table long enough to seat 20 still in place beneath a drop cloth gone gray with age. A library with bookshelves covering 3 walls and the shelves still full, the books in various states, some apparently fine and some warped beyond any future use from years of humidity cycling. A kitchen with original equipment from the 1940s or early 1950s, a gas range and ceramic sink and cold pantry that would need replacing but had been maintained with care. Each room had been maintained up to a point, and then beyond that point had simply aged, the way things aged when the person responsible for them had aged also, doing what was possible and leaving the rest to time. Behind the kitchen, a short passage led to a small room with a cot, a wood stove, and a shelf holding a few objects. This was where Rosa had lived. The room was spare and clean, smelling of old wood smoke and something faintly herbal, and the cot was made with military corners. The shelf held a Bible, a coffee cup, and a small framed photograph. Marisol picked up the photograph. 2 young women stood in front of a flowering tree in bright sunlight. One of them was unmistakably a young version of Abuela Consuelo. The jaw and the posture and the particular way she carried her shoulders exactly as Marisol remembered from childhood. The other woman was a stranger who was not quite a stranger, because the family resemblance was clear in their shared jaw and in something about the eyes. Rosa had kept her sister's photograph for 60 years in this small room and had looked at it every day from the cot, where she slept alone in a house she had inherited and chosen never to use. Marisol put the photograph carefully in her coat pocket. She found Cora in the dining room, standing at the far end of the long table and running one finger through the dust on its surface, drawing a line that went from one end of the table toward the other in a slow arc. The girl looked up when her mother came in, and her face held the particular quality it had when she was processing something that was larger than she had expected. "Is this whole floor just for us, Mama?" Cora said. Her voice was not awed. It was a voice doing arithmetic, measuring the gap between what her body knew of space and what her eyes were now seeing. The enormous room and the long table and the tall windows looking out over the dead garden. All of it in some configuration that her 8-year-old experience of the world had not prepared her for. "Just for us," Marisol said. Cora looked around the room again. She nodded slowly, in the way she nodded when she was filing something away. Then she went back to drawing her slow arc through the dust on the table. They spent the rest of that first afternoon making Rosa's back room habitable. The wood stove lit readily, the wood stacked against the cottage wall outside still dry from a tarp Rosa had kept over it, and the stove's draw was clean, the chimney for this section of the building maintained even when others were not. The room warmed in under an hour. Marisol made up Cora's sleeping bag on the cot and arranged her own blanket on the floor beside it. Cora put her library books on the shelf next to Rosa's Bible, put her stuffed dog in the corner where the cot met the wall, and settled in with her current book and her knees up, reading with the focused quiet that meant she was satisfied with the situation. Marisol sat on the floor with her back against the wall and the ring of 17 keys in her hand. She went through them one by one, reading each label. Front door, back door, cellar, workshop, upper storage, side entrance, garage, root cellar, and then, at the end of the ring, for keys with labels that required more than one reading to take in fully. The first 3 of these were bound together on a separate smaller ring with a twist of wire, differentiated from all the others by their age and their design, heavier than the modern keys, and made with the specificity of things built before standardization. Below the wire, a small tag had been folded and attached to one of them. The handwriting was Rosa's, the same careful, deliberate hand she recognized from the key labels. "Cecil kept his promises," the tag read. "Follow what he showed me. For whoever comes after." The 4th key, separate from the others and on its own small loop, bore only a number. No other label. The number was scratched into the tape with a pinpoint rather than written, as if labeling it with words had seemed either unnecessary or insufficient. Marisol sat with the keys for a long time while the wood stove ticked and the light in the small window behind it dropped toward 4 in the afternoon. Outside, wind moved through whatever remained of the old orchard along the southern edge of the property. Inside, the room smelled of wood smoke and warmth. She put all 4 keys in her coat pocket with Rosa's photograph. The first 2 weeks were work and little else. The structural priorities declared themselves the way they always do, by what they would cost you if you continued to ignore them. The northwest window opening needed to be boarded from inside immediately, because without that barrier the 3rd floor was open to weather and the moisture was moving through the floor and beginning to affect the 2nd. The collapsed porch sections needed to be cleared and the remaining sound sections reinforced before the weight distribution on the front face shifted further than it already had. The crack at the base of the fieldstone chimney needed a patch that would at minimum stop water running down inside the east wall. She had no construction experience when she arrived. She acquired what she needed the way she had always acquired things, by finding the right resources and being systematic about using them. The county library in Greer's Hollow stocked an extensive collection of home repair manuals, and she checked them out in stacks. Gerald Hatch had a nephew named Dennis who was a general contractor, and Dennis drove out twice in the first 2 weeks to walk through the ground floor with her, at no charge because Hatch had asked him to, pointing out what was urgent and what could wait and what was beyond her current capacity. He was a man of few words and precise ones, and he did not make her feel foolish for asking basic questions, and she was grateful for this in a way she noted without dwelling on. Dennis showed her how to use a level. He showed her how to read the structural condition of a floor joist without removing the subfloor. He told her which of the ground floor ceilings could be probed with a screwdriver to check for water damage in the framing above, and which rooms showed enough lateral stability in their wall framing that they could be used without concern. He walked through the kitchen twice and said the gas connection to the range was intact, which meant heat for cooking and an additional source of warmth, and that this was more important than it might sound in a structure of this size through a Catskills winter. She thanked him. He handed her a list of hardware store items in order of priority and drove back down the gravel track. The money was the problem it had always been. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story, only with a different shape. She had arrived at the property with less than $300, and the first week's supplies cost $60 of that. She called the home health aid agency she had worked for in the city and asked about remote administrative work. They had nothing. She submitted 2 applications to the Greer's Harlow Medical Center for per diem CNA work. She applied for the Emergency Housing Stabilization Program through the state. Given that she was now residing in a structure that was her own, but not yet legally habitable under county standards. Dennis's nephew, who worked for the county assessor's office, managed to route the county health department's inquiry about habitation away from formal proceedings by clarifying that the caretaker's room was technically a separate structure and had been maintained in residential condition continuously. This was approximately true. Cora enrolled at the Greer's Harlow Elementary School and took the yellow bus that came down the county road at 7:15 and returned at 3:40. Her daughter reported at the end of the first week that there was a girl in her class named Waverly who knew a great deal about horses and intended to teach her, and that the school library had a section on underground geography that Cora had begun working through systematically, because she had recently developed an interest in limestone formations and cave systems after reading a book about it in the city shelter during the week they had been there. It was Cora who found the notebook. She found it on a Saturday in the 3rd week, in the library, while Marisol was outside working on the porch bracing with a level and a box of screws she'd bought secondhand from the hardware store. Cora had spent the morning at the kitchen table with her cave books, and then announced she was going to do a survey, a word she had adopted from one of her geology texts and applied to her own explorations of the ground floor rooms. She moved through them with the careful attention of a researcher, touching things gently and reporting back to Marisol at the front door at intervals. The notebook was on the bottom shelf of the library, behind a row of larger volumes on metallurgy and land surveying, pushed so far back that it was invisible from any angle except lying flat on the floor and looking directly along the shelf from the end. This was Cora's angle for examining things that interested her. She brought it to Marisol on the porch. It was a composition notebook, the black and white marbled kind, with a strip of tape across the front on which someone had written in Rosa's formal handwriting, "For whoever comes." We kept our word. Marisol sat down on the porch step and opened it. The first page was in a different hand. Older, more elaborate, a penmanship taught in schools before typewriters made it academic. The letters formed with loops and precise angles. The ink had faded to a warm brown that placed it in a different century from the present. The writing covered the first page and continued onto the second and the third. "If you are reading this and Rosa is gone," it began, "then it means she kept her word and I kept mine, and I want you to understand both of those things before you see what I am going to tell you about. I want to explain why I did what I did and why I chose her, and what I believe about the right way to hold on to something of value in a world that tends to destroy valuable things carelessly." The signature at the bottom of the final page of his section was Cecil Harlow, and the date was October of 1976. Marisol turned the page. She read for 2 hours on the porch step while the afternoon light moved across the property and Cora sat beside her drawing horses in her sketchbook with a purple pen, filling page after page with horses of varying sizes and accuracy, pausing occasionally to ask questions that Marisol answered without looking up. Harlow had written for 19 pages in his faded brown ink. He wrote about himself with the brevity of someone who considered personal history less important than fact, giving only enough context to make the facts comprehensible. He had grown up in this county, the son of a man who had owned a sawmill and died, leaving him the land and a modest sum that Harlow had increased through patient investment across several decades. He had traveled. He had studied art history through correspondence and through the patient accumulation of books, which explained the library downstairs with its walls of reference volumes on painting, sculpture, metallurgy, coinage, cartography. He had spent 30 years building relationships with people who had access to things that rarely appeared in any public market, things that moved from one private collection to another through channels that had nothing to do with auction houses or galleries. He had been, in his precise and unboastful way, one of the more accomplished private collectors of the mid-20th century, operating entirely outside any context that would have made his name recognizable. What he had collected was in the lower rooms, in the space below the north wing, behind the door that required the key marked in Rosa's diagram. It had been there since 1963, when he completed the last significant addition to what he had assembled. He described the contents in one long paragraph, methodical and unemotional, the way a careful person might describe the contents of a room before locking it for a long time. By the time she reached the end of Harlow's pages and turned to find Rosa's continuation in her careful printing, the light had begun to flatten toward 4 o'clock, and Marisol had understood enough to know that what she had come to was not what she had thought she had come to. Rosa's section was written in dated entries spanning from late 1977 to 2019, the year she had updated her will. The entries were short and practical. They were occasionally moving in the way practical writing becomes moving when it describes a life organized entirely around a single kept promise. The first read, "Cecil is gone. The house is mine by the will, and I mean to honor what we agreed. I have counted everything, and it is as he described. I will maintain what is there, and I will not touch it. He trusted me with this, and I intend to deserve that trust. I will find whoever comes next when the time is right." Later entries describe tax payments and repairs, the years in which the roof over the east wing had failed and been patched with materials she could afford. The winter the creek had risen and the cellar had taken water. The careful accounting of what remained stable and what was slipping and what could wait for whoever came after. In 2015, an entry, "I have not found the right person yet. I have written to Consuelo's family 3 times and received no answer. But I am looking in other ways now. There is another way of looking, and I am patient." And in 2019, "I have found her. She does not know yet. I believe she will do the right thing. I believe she is the kind of person who takes care of things. That is enough for me." Marisol closed the notebook and sat with it on the porch in the cooling afternoon air. Her great-aunt had watched her from a distance for years, had written to her family and received no reply, the letters going to addresses that had changed, had found her eventually through whatever internet searching was available to a woman in her late 80s in a rural county, or through someone willing to help her with that searching, had read a newspaper article about a tenant assistance drive and a community health fair and decided that this was the person. The notebook's last page, after Rosa's final entry, held a small diagram. It was drawn with a ruler, in pencil that had been gone over once in ink, a floor plan of a space Marisol had not yet seen. The dimensions were marked in feet. Rooms were indicated by careful rectangles with abbreviated labels. One label was circled twice, the second circle pressing deep enough that it had left an impression through to the back of the page. Below the circle were 4 words in Rosa's hand. "This is where everything." Beside the circled room, in the margin, the number corresponding to one of the 17 keys had been scratched with a pinpoint. Marisol found the key on the ring. It was heavier than the others, older in its design, made with the precision of something intended to outlast its maker by a considerable margin. The kind of mechanism built before mass production changed what locks were expected to be. That night Marisol sat in Rosa's small room after Cora was asleep and read both sections of the notebook again by the camping lantern she had brought from the city. The wood stove had burned down to coals, and the room was warm in the close way of rooms heated by radiant heat rather than forced air. Outside the single window the property was fully dark, the kind of rural dark that has weight to it, where there are no ambient lights from nearby buildings and the sky, when there are no clouds, shows its full depth. She read Harlow's pages twice. She read Rosa's 3 times. The second reading of Rosa's entries caught things the first had missed. There was an entry from 1988, brief and matter-of-fact, recording that she had turned down an approach from a developer who had heard rumors about the property's contents and wanted to purchase. She did not describe the interaction beyond saying that he had been persistent and had sent a representative 3 times, and that she had referred him to her attorney each time, and that after the third referral, he had stopped coming. There was another entry from 2003 recording a break-in attempt at the outbuilding closest to the north wing, and the installation of additional locks she had purchased herself and fitted with the help of a neighbor who was now also dead. Rosa had spent 60 years protecting something she had promised never to touch and never to reveal to anyone she did not fully trust. She had done this in practical solitude, maintaining the locks and the secrecy and the annual tax payments, watching the world change around the property without letting any of that change breach the commitment she had made to a man who had trusted her with everything he valued. The weight of it was considerable. Marisol sat with it and let it settle. What Cecil Harlow had written described a life's work, the work of a man who had spent most of his adult years collecting things that other people did not know how to value or did not have the patience to pursue. He wrote about this plainly and without boasting, describing a methodology built on patience and research and the particular advantage of being both financially capable and genuinely uninterested in recognition. He had begun in the 1930s and continued for 4 decades. He had traveled widely and maintained correspondences with people who knew things that were not publicly known and who were willing to share that knowledge with someone they trusted. He had stored what he acquired in the only place he was certain was safe, which was his own property, in rooms he had designed and built himself over the course of several years, with the help of 2 men long dead by the time he wrote this letter, men who had understood that discretion was part of what he was paying them for. He had no children. He had no family willing to steward what he had accumulated with the care it required. He had Rosa, who had been with him for 17 years by the time he wrote this, and who he trusted completely, and to whom he was leaving everything, including the responsibility of finding someone worthy to come after. He described what was there. He described it in terms of categories rather than precise inventories, but he was specific enough that Marisol sat for a long time after the first reading simply breathing. She put the notebook on the shelf beside the keys and laid down in the dark room with her daughters breathing slow and even beside her. The stone walls of Rosa's small room held the day's warmth. Outside, wind moved through the orchard trees along the southern property line. In the morning they would find the rooms that Rosa's diagram described. They would follow the key marked in the margin to what Cecil Harlow had promised her great-aunt and what Rosa had spent 60 years keeping safe for whoever came after. Marisol lay still and looked at the ceiling in the dark. She had not felt afraid since arriving here. Uncertain, yes, and tired in the specific way that comes from sustained effort without rest, but not afraid. What she felt now was something quieter than fear and more demanding. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something whose dimensions she could not yet see, something that had been held in place for a long time by the faith of a woman who had read about her in a newspaper and decided she was worth the wait. She intended to be worth it. She closed her eyes and listened to the house settle around them in the cold. Old stone buildings settled differently from wood frame structures, not the creak and pop of expanding and contracting lumber, but something lower and more intermittent, a sound that belonged less to the building and more to the ground beneath it, the rock and clay shifting by degrees so small they were measurable only over generations. The house had been settling for 100 years. It would continue settling long after whatever came next. This did not feel threatening to her. It felt like context, the correct scale against which to measure the urgency she had been carrying since the marshals knocked that morning 6 weeks ago. She did not sleep for a long time. In the morning they would go through the house floor by floor, the way she went through every hard thing, methodically and without rushing toward the conclusion before she understood the path. She put her hand flat against the plaster wall of Rosa's room in the dark and felt the faint warmth the stone had stored from the wood stove, and kept it there until her daughter's breathing slowed and settled, and she was sure Cora was genuinely asleep, and not simply being still in the way children were sometimes still when they were listening for something they couldn't name. The morning came gray and very still, the kind of November morning where the cold sits without movement and the breath comes out white against the air. Marisol woke at 5:30 to a wood stove that had gone entirely cold and a small room that had begun to take on the chill of the surrounding house. She lit the stove again, fed it carefully until the kindling caught and the larger pieces began to draw, and put the kettle on the iron top for tea. Cora woke at 6, rolling onto her back and lying still for a moment with her eyes open before she said good morning. Marisol said good morning back. They drank tea from the 2 mismatched mugs Marisol had bought at the dollar store along with everything else, and ate toast made directly on the stovetop because the gas range had not yet been deemed safe enough to use for anything that required the oven. They ate at Rosa's small table by the window, watching the property turn gradually from gray to silver as the sun came up behind the eastern treeline. Today we go through the house, Marisol said. Like the survey, said Cora. Like the survey, yes. But more careful, because we're looking for one specific thing. Cora nodded around her toast and waited for the rest. The diagram, Marisol said. She brought out the composition notebook and turned it to the page with Rosa's drawn floor plan, the circled room, the number in the margin. We need to find a room that matches this. It's somewhere I haven't been yet. Probably below the ground floor. Cora studied the diagram with the concentration she brought to maps. The proportions, she said. This big rectangle is bigger than the smaller ones. So if these are rooms along a hallway, the big one is at the end. Yes, and the door has to be hidden. Otherwise Rosa wouldn't have needed to make us a map. Yes. Okay, Cora said. She put the notebook back on the table carefully, the way she put down things she was treating with the respect they had earned. Are we ready? Almost. Marisol put on her coat, then helped Cora into hers. She took the ring of 17 keys from the shelf and put them in her pocket. She thought for a moment about whether to bring the camping lantern as well, then took it. Whatever they found, they were not going to find it in a place that had electric light. She added a flashlight from her bag, her notebook, and a pencil. If they found rooms she didn't yet know about, she wanted to make her own map. They started at the front door and worked outward from there. The ground floor had 11 rooms by Marisol's count, not including the back passage to Rosa's small chamber and the side hall that led toward the kitchen pantry. They went through each one in order, opening every door and looking behind every standing piece of furniture, tapping baseboards, checking for the small irregularities that might indicate a concealed access. The library required the most time. 3 walls of bookshelves with books still on them, and Marisol had Cora kneel and look along the bottom shelves the way she had been doing instinctively all along, while Marisol looked at the higher ones for any irregularity in spacing or any shelf that didn't quite line up with its neighbors. They found nothing on the ground floor that suggested a hidden access. The wallpaper, where it had peeled cleanly away from solid plaster. The floors, where they were exposed, were continuous wide plank oak with no irregularity that suggested a trapdoor. Marisol had not really expected to find it on this floor. The diagram showed a room considerably larger than any she had seen so far, which meant it was almost certainly below. They went down to the cellar. The cellar entrance was off the kitchen, behind a door that Hatch had unlocked on her first visit, but which she had not gone fully into since. The stairs were narrow and made of cut stone, descending 16 steps to a packed dirt floor and a series of rooms with stone walls and wooden ceiling joists overhead, the joists supporting the kitchen and the back of the house above. The cellar was cold, several degrees colder than the rooms upstairs, and very still. The air had the faintly mineral smell of stone that had been underground for a long time. Marisol went down first with the lantern raised, watching where she put her feet. The stone steps were worn in the center where many feet had used them over a century, a smooth dip in each tread that suggested generations of careful use. At the bottom she stopped and turned in a slow circle, letting the lantern light reach the corners. Cora descended behind her one step at a time, her small hand brushing the stone wall on the right side for balance. There were 5 rooms down here. A root cellar with empty wooden shelves and a small ventilation grate set high in the wall, letting in a narrow column of pale gray light. A coal cellar that had not held coal in many decades but still carried the faint dark residue along its lower walls. A space that looked like it had once held a furnace, the iron connections still visible in the floor and ceiling, and a circular pad of fire brick where the boiler had stood. A storage room with old farm equipment, a cracked harness hanging on a peg, an iron plow blade leaning against a wall, a wooden crate of small tools whose handles had gone gray with age, and a fifth room at the end of the central passage, the room Marisol had not previously opened, behind a plain wooden door with a simple iron lock. She tried the key labeled cellar. The door swung open easily. Inside was an empty rectangular room with a stone floor and 3 plain walls, and a fourth wall covered entirely by a tall wooden shelving unit that had been built into the room, fixed to the wall behind it. The shelving unit ran from floor to ceiling and from one corner of the room to the other. It was made of heavy oak, dark with age, and its shelves held nothing. They were entirely empty, every one of them. 12 shelves, all bare. Cora stepped past her mother and stood looking at the shelving unit with the still attention she brought to puzzles. Why would somebody build a really big shelf and leave it empty? Cora said. Marisol set the lantern on the stone floor and adjusted its wick higher. Why would somebody? She repeated to herself. She walked to the shelving unit and ran her fingers along its outer edge where it met the wall. The wood was tight against the stone. She crouched and ran her fingers along the bottom edge where it met the floor. No gap there either. The unit was either built into the room or fitted with the kind of precision that made it appear so. She stepped back and looked at the whole wall again. The unit was symmetrical, she saw now, in a way that empty shelving rarely was. 12 shelves arranged in 3 columns of 4 each, the columns separated by vertical dividers that were thicker than the horizontal shelves. The middle column ran floor to ceiling without a break at the top or bottom, where the outer columns had a small decorative cap at the top and a small skirt at the bottom that did not appear in the middle. Marisol pressed her palm flat against the center of the middle column, low, near the floor. She pressed her palm flat against the center of it, higher, at her waist level, then higher, at her shoulder. At her shoulder, the wood gave very slightly. Not the give of a panel that had failed, but the controlled small give of something hinged. She stepped back. She looked at Cora. I think we found it, she said. Cora's eyes went wide in the lantern light and then settled. She had the kind of face that registered excitement once and then composed itself into focused attention for whatever came next. How does it open? Cora said. Marisol pressed again, this time with both palms flat against the middle column at shoulder height, applying steady pressure rather than a push. The whole center column hinged inward at the top, swinging back into a dark space behind it. There was a faint hiss of air, the displacement of pressure from a room that had been sealed for a very long time meeting the room they stood in. She and Cora both stood still for a moment, looking at the dark opening. The smell that came out was not the smell of decay. It was the smell of cold, dry stone, the smell of paper that had been kept properly, the smell of beeswax and old leather, and something faintly metallic that Marisol could not immediately identify. It was the smell of a room that had been sealed in a state of careful preservation. She picked up the lantern from the floor. Stay close, she said. She did not have to say it. Cora had already moved to her side. The opening behind the shelving unit gave onto a short flight of stone steps, 6 of them, descending to a corridor that ran in a single straight line into the dark beyond the lantern's reach. The walls of the corridor were the same cut granite as the foundation of the house above, and the ceiling was vaulted with brick. The floor was a smooth flagstone laid in a regular pattern. Marisol descended carefully, lantern held high. Cora followed exactly 2 steps behind her, the way Cora had always followed when they were going somewhere unfamiliar, close enough to touch, but not actually touching, giving Marisol the room she needed to be the one in front. The corridor was 20 paces long. At its end was an iron-bound oak door set into a stone frame, with a heavy lock at waist level and no other hardware. Marisol set the lantern down and brought out the ring of keys. She found the one Rosa had marked in the diagram, the heavy old key with the number scratched into the tape. She fitted to the lock. It turned smoothly. She had expected it to be stiff after so many decades, but the mechanism had been oiled at some point in the not-distant past, perhaps within the last few years, perhaps by Rosa herself in her late 80s, going down here alone with her own lantern to keep the lock functional for whoever would eventually come. The thought of an old woman descending these stairs alone year after year to maintain a door for a person who did not yet exist sat heavy in Marisol's chest. She pushed the door open. The lantern light reached into a chamber that was much larger than the corridor outside it, 20 feet wide, perhaps 40 feet long, although the far end was beyond the lantern's reach. The ceiling vaulted overhead in the same brick pattern as the corridor. The floor was the same smooth flagstone. The walls were stone, with what appeared to be wooden cabinetry built along them, deep cabinets with closed doors and brass handles dulled by time. The center of the room held a long oak table running its length, and along the table, set on padded stands or laid flat on cloth that had once been white and had aged to a warm cream, were objects. Marisol stood in the doorway with the lantern raised. She could see, in the immediate circle of light, perhaps a dozen of them. A bronze object the size of her hand, ribbed and dark, that might have been an oil lamp from somewhere very far away and very long ago. A small carved figure of pale stone, the size of her palm, of a woman holding something at her chest. A flat package wrapped in cloth, the cloth tied with a faded ribbon. A stack of leather-bound books with no titles on their spines. A small wooden case with a hinged lid, closed. She did not move forward. She stood in the doorway and let her breath settle. Cora pressed against her side, looking around her mother into the room. "Mama," Cora said. "I see them. What are they?" "I don't know yet, baby." She took one step inside and stopped again. The room held the same cold, dry air as the corridor and the same faint smell of preserved paper and beeswax. The walls absorbed the lantern light without reflecting it back. The room had the quality, common to certain underground spaces and certain old churches, of being separate from time in a way Marisol could feel in her body before she could describe it in words. She walked the length of the table slowly, the lantern held above each object as she passed. She did not touch anything. Touching was not what this moment was for. This moment was for confirming that what Cecil Harlow had written in the notebook was real, and that he had not been speaking metaphorically, and that the responsibility she had inherited from Rosa was the responsibility of an actual room containing actual objects of the kind he had described. She counted as she went. The objects laid out along the table were not arranged in any obvious order, but they had clearly been placed with care. The padded stands beneath the larger pieces were custom, fitted to each object, made of dark wood and dark cloth. The cream-colored fabric beneath the flat pieces was a heavy, unbleached linen that had been laundered properly before being laid down, the kind of linen that museum people used. 46 objects on the table by her count. Give or take a few, she was uncertain whether to count separately, each one with the quality of having been considered before being placed. Some she could partially identify from her one art history elective and from the books in the library upstairs that she had been working through in her spare hours. A small bronze that looked Roman, or perhaps something pretending to be Roman that was older than Roman. 2 illuminated pages cut from larger manuscripts and now mounted under glass, the gold leaf catching the lantern light in small precise flickers. A piece of jade carving that even her uneducated eye could see was extraordinary. A leather-bound book whose spine bore a date in Roman numerals that, if it was authentic, placed it in the early 16th century. She stopped counting after a certain point because counting was beginning to feel like a way of avoiding the larger thing she was looking at. At the far end of the table, the lantern light fell on the row of cabinets along the back wall. Their doors were closed. Brass handles, a keyhole in each. Above the cabinets, set into the stone of the wall itself, was a single framed object. A painting, Marisol thought at first, though she could not see the details from where she stood. She moved closer. It was a painting. Oil on a wooden panel rather than canvas, perhaps 15 inches across and 20 high, set in a simple, unornamented frame that was almost certainly original to it. The subject was a woman in dark clothing seated near a window, her face turned 3/4 away from the viewer, the light from the window falling across her shoulder and the side of her face, and the white edge of a small piece of cloth in her hand. The brushwork was very fine. The light was very particular. Marisol stood in front of it with the lantern raised and did not, at first, breathe. She knew very little about painting. She had taken one art history elective in community college because it fit her schedule, and she remembered almost nothing of it specifically. But she knew this painting, or she knew something very like it. The arrangement of light and the quality of the cloth and the precision of the small details all carried a particular signature that had been reproduced in every art textbook she had ever opened, and that anyone who had grown up anywhere near a museum had encountered enough times to recognize without being able to name. She did not name it now. Naming it would have required her to believe what she was looking at. and she was not ready to do that yet. She would believe it when she could verify it, in proper light, with someone who knew what they were looking at. She stood for another moment and then turned away from the wall. Cora had not followed her down the length of the table. Cora had stayed near the door, watching, with the particular still attention she brought to situations that contained more meaning than she had yet been told. She was a child who did not interrupt processes. She waited. Marisol walked back to the door. "We're going to go back upstairs now," she said. "We're going to think about what we just saw. And then we're going to come back with more light, and we're going to be very careful." Cora nodded. Marisol stepped back into the corridor and turned to look at the room one more time before she closed the door. The lantern light caught the line of objects on the table and the closed cabinets and the small painting on the back wall, and the room behind her held its quiet and its cold and its careful preservation of something Cecil Harlow had spent 40 years assembling and Rosa Elena Vega had spent 60 years keeping secret. She pulled the door closed. The lock engaged with a small, precise click. They climbed back up to the cellar, and Marisol pressed the wooden panel of the shelving unit back into place. It hinged closed smoothly, settling into its frame so that there was no visible seam. In the kitchen, Marisol sat down at the table by the window and put her hands flat on the wood. Cora sat across from her and did the same. They stayed like that for a while without speaking. Eventually, Cora said, in her practical voice, "That was a lot." Marisol nodded. "What do we do?" Cora said. "I don't know yet. I think we need to find someone who knows about old things. Someone who can tell us what we have and what to do about it and how to do it without making any mistakes. Like an expert. Like an expert. How do we find one?" Marisol thought about this. "We start with Mr. Hatch," she said. "He's been a lawyer in this county for 40 years. He knows people. We tell him what we found, and we ask him who we should talk to next, and we go from there." Cora considered this. "Are we going to tell him exactly what we saw? We are going to tell him enough that he can help us. We are not going to tell anyone else for a while, and that includes Waverly and your teachers and anyone at the school, even if they ask about the house. Can you do that?" Cora considered this seriously, the way she considered most things. "I can do that," she said. "Is that because we don't trust them?" "It's because we don't know what we have yet, and until we know what we have, we can't decide who needs to know about it. People do strange things when they think there's something valuable around. The fewer people who have to make decisions about that right now, the safer we are." Cora nodded slowly. "Mom," she said. "Yes. Are we rich now?" Marisol did not answer immediately. She looked at her daughter across the kitchen table in the small house she had inherited from a woman she had never met, and she thought about how to answer the question accurately. "I don't know what we are yet," she said. "We have something that belongs to us, but we don't know what it's worth in money, and we don't know what's going to happen when other people find out we have it. So I'm going to be careful before I say what we are." "Okay, okay," said Cora. "But," Marisol said, "we are at least not the same thing we were yesterday." Cora absorbed this. Then she said, "We should call Abuela." "We will. Soon. First, Mr. Hatch." The truck came up the gravel track at 11 that morning, 3 hours after they had come back up from the cellar, while Marisol was still drafting the careful sentences she would say to Gerald Hatch on the prepaid phone. It was not Hatch's truck. It was a black SUV, newer model, the kind of vehicle that did not normally belong on a track like this one. It pulled up to the front of the house and parked, and a man got out. He was in his early 40s, dressed in country wear that was too clean to belong to any local farmer she had seen. Tan canvas jacket, dark jeans, work boots that had never been broken in. He had close-cut dark hair going slightly gray at the temples and an alert, friendly expression that read as the practiced friendliness of someone whose work required him to be liked quickly. Marisol stepped out onto the porch with Cora behind her. The man smiled. He came up to the steps with one hand raised in a small wave. "You must be Miss Vega," he said. "I heard there was someone new out here. My name is Quentin Marsh. I work with North Slope Holdings. We have an office in town. I'm sorry to come by unannounced. I tried to call, but I think the number we had on file was the one from the previous owner." "Mr. Marsh," said Marisol. "Just Quentin, please. I won't take much of your time. I just wanted to come up and introduce myself and let you know that if there's anything you need as you're getting settled in, my office can probably help with it. We've had an interest in this property for a long time. It's a beautiful piece of land, and we'd love to talk with you about it whenever you're ready." Marisol looked at him for a moment without responding. "I appreciate you coming by," she said. I'm not in a position to talk about the property today. I've only just arrived. Of course. Of course. He smiled wider, and the smile did not reach his eyes in any way that mattered. I just wanted you to know we exist, so to speak. And I want to say, I knew your great aunt. Not well, but I met her several times. She was a remarkable woman. How did you know her? We approached her on several occasions about the property. She was always very polite, always very firm. I see, said Marisol. When you're ready, he said, you should give us a call. We're prepared to be very generous about the value here. I know a property like this can be a lot to take on, especially in the condition it's in. We could make this very easy for you. He held out a card. Marisol took it. The card was thick, expensive paper, printed with a small graphic logo and a phone number. She put it in her pocket without looking at it. Mr. Marsh, she said. Quentin, I appreciate you coming. I'll be in touch when I'm ready to think about it. He nodded. He looked at the house behind her with the assessing gaze of someone who was cataloging what he saw and pricing it. Then he looked at Cora, briefly, with the brief assessment of someone who was checking to see what kind of household this was. Then he smiled again and went back to his vehicle. Marisol watched him drive away. She stood on the porch until the sound of the engine was gone from the gravel track and the property was quiet again. Then she went inside and called Gerald Hatch. He came out himself, that afternoon, in his old red pickup, climbing down with the small care of a man in his 70s, but with no other concession to his age. Marisol met him on the porch with coffee in one of the dollar store mugs. He took it gratefully and sat on the front step where the porch had been stabilized, since the rest of it was still officially unsafe. You said it was something to talk about in person, he said. It is, she said. She told him about the notebook, about Rosa's diagram, about the shelving unit in the cellar and what was behind it. She did not describe what was in the chamber in any detail except to say that it contained objects which appeared to be old and which Cecil Harlow had described in his portion of the notebook in terms that suggested significant value, and that there was a painting on the back wall that she believed might require expert verification. She kept her language careful. She kept her face calm. She had practiced both of these things on the phone before he arrived. Hatch listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat for a moment looking at the coffee in his mug, and then he set it down on the step beside him. I knew Cecil, he said. Marisol waited. Not well, said Hatch. I was a young man when he was old. He used my father's firm for some matters in the early 70s. My father said he was the most private, wealthy man he ever represented. He kept his life entirely to himself. He never married, never had visible friends in town, never participated in civic life. He just lived out here with Rosa and his books and his correspondences. After he died, I took over Rosa's account from my father in 1993, and I have to say I always suspected there was more to that property than the assessor's office knew about. Rosa was too careful for there not to be. She had a lot to be careful about, Marisol said. It seems so. Mr. Hatch, there was a man here this morning. Quentin Marsh. Hatch's expression moved very slightly. I know Quentin, he said. I know his firm. What can you tell me about him? Hatch looked out across the cleared ground in front of the house, the bare trees beyond it, the gravel track where the SUV had been. He's competent, said Hatch. He's worked for North Slope Holdings for about 15 years. North Slope is a development consortium that owns property across several Catskills counties. They have been interested in this parcel for as long as I have practiced law here. Rosa turned them down more than once. They were always within the law in their approach, but they were persistent. The current Mr. Marsh's grandfather was, I believe, one of the original people who approached Rosa in the 70s. The family has had a long memory about this property. Why? Said Marisol. What about this parcel specifically? Hatch considered the question with the care she had already come to recognize in him. The small pause that meant he was deciding which version of an answer to give and was opting for the version that respected her capacity to hear it. That is a question I have wondered about for 30 years, he said. The land is good, but it is not the best land in the county. The location is decent, but not strategic. The acreage is substantial, but no more than several other parcels that have come available over the same period, and that North Slope did not pursue with anything like this kind of persistence. If I had to guess, I would guess that someone in the original generation of their leadership knew something about the property that was passed down to the next generation as institutional memory. Not necessarily the specifics. Possibly only a strong suspicion. but strong enough that the firm has kept its eye on this place across 3 generations of its own leadership. Marisol thought about the photograph that was sitting at that moment in Quentin Marsh's folder, which she did not yet know was coming. Someone knew Harlow, she said. Hatch nodded once. Possibly. Or, someone knew someone who had reason to think Harlow had something worth keeping. Cecil Harlow had correspondence across the country and in Europe through most of his life. He was discreet, but he was not invisible. People with the kind of patience and resources North Slope has had over the years can sometimes piece things together from very small fragments. Mr. Hatch, said Marisol, what do you think is going to happen now? Hatch turned back to her. I think, he said, that you are going to need help. Quietly and competently, and from people who can be trusted. I think the first thing we need to do is find you an appraiser, someone who can come out here without drawing attention, look at what you have, and tell us what we are actually dealing with. I think the second thing we need to do is talk about the legal structure of how you hold this property and its contents. And I think the third thing we need to do is be very careful about who knows about the existence of that room. The fewer people who know, the better, until you have decided how you want to handle it. Marisol nodded. I can help with the first two, said Hatch. I have a colleague in Albany who handles estate matters for high-value collections. She is discreet. She will know who to bring in for a proper appraisal. I will call her this afternoon, if you want me to. Yes, said Marisol. Please. The third part, said Hatch, is going to be on you. You and Cora, and whoever else you decide to bring into this. And I have to tell you, Ms. Vega, that small towns are not actually as quiet as people imagine them to be. People are going to notice that a woman from the city is now living in the Harlow house. People are going to notice if appraisers start coming and going. North Slope is going to notice. They have probably already noticed that you exist. The question is how much they know about what is on the property. Marisol thought about this. Do you think they know about the room? She asked. Hatch considered. I don't know, he said. I don't think they would have been so persistent over so many decades if they only wanted the land for development. There are easier parcels for that. But I also don't think they could know specifically what is there, because Rosa would not have told them and nobody else knew. I suspect they have always suspected, however. People with money have a certain instinct for where other money is hidden. Marisol looked at the card in her hand from her coat pocket. North Slope Holdings, in clean black lettering. Quentin Marsh, Acquisitions Director. She put it back in her pocket. Thank you, she said. Hatch finished his coffee and set the empty mug on the step. You are welcome, he said. Rosa picked you for a reason. I'm going to assume she was right about that, until I have a reason to think otherwise. And I have not yet been given any reason. He stood, slowly, with his hand on his knee for support. I will call my colleague this afternoon, he said. Expect a phone call within a day. She walked him back to his truck. Before he got in, he turned and looked at her one more time. Be careful tonight, he said. Tonight specifically. Tonight, and every night. If they think you've found what they think might be here, things may begin happening faster than you would expect. I am not trying to alarm you. I am asking you to be careful. She nodded. He drove away down the gravel track in the late afternoon light. That evening, after Cora was asleep, Marisol sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open and the camping lantern lit beside her, and she made a list. She wrote in her small, precise handwriting. The first list was things she needed to do, in order. Speak with Hatch's colleague when she called. Arrange an appraisal of the chamber contents with absolute discretion. Secure the entrance to the chamber with a better lock if possible. Document everything she had seen with photographs, using the prepaid phone, so that there would be a record if anything was disturbed. Find out everything she could about North Slope Holdings and Quentin Marsh, using the library computer in Greer's Hollow rather than her own laptop, so that her search history would not be traceable. Call Abuela Consuelo, not to tell her anything specific, but to make sure her grandmother knew she and Cora were well, and to hear her grandmother's voice, because she had been carrying things alone and a voice from home would help. The second list was a list of people. People she could trust. Hatch went on it, with a small question mark beside his name because she had only known him for a few weeks, although the question mark felt smaller than it had a week ago. Dennis the contractor went on it for the same reason and with the same mark. Mrs. Whitman, who ran the small lending library in town and who had taken an interest in Cora's reading and recommended books with the particular care of a librarian who took her recommendations seriously. Abuela Consuelo, in California, went on it without a question mark. Cora was at the top, before any of them, and did not need a question mark either. The third list, which she made after sitting for a while looking at the second one, was the list of things she was not going to do. She was not going to sell the contents of the chamber in any quick way to anyone, including to whatever experts came to appraise them. She was not going to make any decision about the property under pressure. She was not going to let what she had found change who she was as a person, or how she treated her daughter, or what she remembered Rosa had done in keeping this for 60 years without taking anything from it. She wrote this third list slowly and deliberately, because she suspected she would need to come back to it. She added one more item to the third list, at the bottom, after thinking about it for a while. She was not going to let fear, including fear of losing this, make her decisions for her. Whatever happened with North Slope Holdings, whatever happened with the appraisal, whatever happened to the property and its contents over the coming months, she was not going to act out of fear. She was going to act out of consideration of what was right, of what Rosa would have done, of what Cora was learning by watching her, and of her own slow, steady judgment. She underlined that item twice. She closed the notebook. She put it on the shelf with the keys and the photograph. She went into Rosa's small room. She lay down beside her sleeping daughter. She listened to Cora breathing in the dark. She listened to the wind moving through the orchard trees and the small, intermittent settlings of the stone house. She listened to herself, to whatever was happening in her own chest, which was complicated and quiet and not entirely unfamiliar. She had been carrying responsibility most of her life. She had carried Abuela Consuelo through the last years before Marisol's cousin took over. She had carried Cora alone since Cora was 3 months old. She had carried her work, her budget, her grandmother's expectations, her own quiet expectations of herself. The thing in the cellar was a different kind of responsibility, larger in dollar terms, almost certainly, than anything she had ever held before. But responsibility was responsibility. It scaled with what was at stake, and what was at stake here was not only the contents of the chamber but the trust that had been placed in her by a man dead 46 years and a woman dead 9 weeks, both of whom had decided, in their separate ways, that she was the person to whom this could be entrusted. She intended to be that person. She fell asleep around midnight with her hand resting lightly on Cora's back, which had always been the way she fell asleep most easily. In the morning the phone rang at 7:30. It was Hatch's colleague in Albany. Her name was Eleanor Krishnan, and she had a voice that was crisp and warm at the same time, a voice that had presumably reassured a great many anxious heirs over a great many phone calls about a great many estates. She had spoken with Hatch the previous evening. She understood the broad outline of the situation. She would not ask Marisol to describe specifics over the phone. She would, however, like to come up to Greer's Hollow with one colleague and meet, and arrange for a discreet on-site assessment of what Marisol had described. How soon, Marisol said. If it suits you, said Eleanor Krishnan, I can be there the day after tomorrow. It suits me, said Marisol. There was a pause on the line, brief and considered. Ms. Vega, said Eleanor Krishnan, I have been doing this work for 26 years. I have seen a great many things. I want you to know 2 things before we meet. The first is that you should not be alarmed if my colleague and I appear to react strongly to what we see. The second is that we will not, under any circumstances, share any information about what we see with anyone outside the engagement we will sign with you, and we will encourage you to sign that engagement before we view anything. I want you to know all of that now, so you do not feel surprised by anything when we arrive. Thank you, said Marisol. Until Wednesday, said Eleanor Krishnan, and the line went silent. Marisol stood in the kitchen with the phone still in her hand and looked out the window at the gravel track, which was empty in the early morning light, and at the bare orchard trees beyond it, and at the eastern treeline where the sun was beginning to rise above the line of the hills. She thought about Quentin Marsh. She thought about the small painting on the back wall of the chamber. She thought about whether she should go down there once more, alone, before Eleanor Krishnan arrived, to see what was in the cabinets. She decided against it. She had said to Hatch that she would be careful, and going back down without a witness present, when the cabinets had not yet been opened by anyone living, would not be the kind of careful she had meant. She would wait. 2 days was not long. She had been waiting for things her entire life, and 2 days was not long. She made breakfast. She woke Cora. She helped her into her clothes and walked her down the gravel track to the county road where the yellow school bus would come and pick her up. They waited together in the cold morning air mother and daughter, and Cora's hand was warm in hers through the thin cotton glove. When the bus came, Cora climbed in and turned and waved through the window, and Marisol waved back, and the bus pulled away down the county road, carrying her daughter to school the way it carried everyone's daughter to school, the same as any other morning. Marisol walked back up the gravel track to the house alone. The black SUV was parked in front of it. She slowed her pace, then stopped. Quentin Marsh was standing on the front porch, leaning against the door frame with his hands in his jacket pockets, waiting for her in a posture that was meant to look casual and did not. He smiled when he saw her. "Miss Vega," he called out. "I hope you don't mind. I was up this way again this morning and thought I would stop in. I have some materials I wanted to leave with you. Things to look over at your leisure." Marisol walked the rest of the way up the gravel track without hurrying. She kept her face neutral. When she reached the front step, she stopped at the bottom of it and looked up at him. "Mr. Marsh," she said. "Quentin," he said. "Mr. Marsh," she said again. "I'm going to ask you not to come onto the property without calling first." His smile did not falter, but it adjusted. "Of course," he said. "I apologize. I should have called." "You should have," she said. "The next time you come without calling, I'm going to ask you to leave and not come back." His smile thinned by a small fraction. "I understand," he said. "I really do apologize. I'll leave these here with you." He set a folder down on the porch step beside him. "There's no rush," he said. "Look at it whenever you want. You can call when you're ready." "Mr. Marsh," said Marisol. He waited. "How long has your company been interested in this property?" 61 years, said Quentin Marsh. She did not let her face change. "That's a long time," she said. "It is. Why so long?" He looked at her with what she now saw clearly was a different expression beneath the friendly one, an expression that had been there the entire time and that she was only now allowed to see because he had decided she had earned the look. "Because we know what's here, Miss Vega," he said. "We don't know exactly what it is, but we know it's here. We have always known, and we are prepared, when you are ready, to make you very wealthy in exchange for it." He stepped down off the porch and walked past her toward his vehicle. He stopped beside it and turned back. "Take your time," he said. "Look through the materials. We'll talk again soon." He got in and drove away. Marisol stood in the gravel of the front clearing for a long while after his vehicle was gone, looking at the folder he had left on the porch step. She did not pick it up immediately. She stood there in the cold and felt the wind move through her coat and watched the bare trees shift in it. Then she went up the steps and picked up the folder and went into the house. In the kitchen, she opened it on the table. It contained a printed offer letter on heavy paper with a clean sans serif letterhead. A cashier's check, which she registered without examining the amount, which would have changed her circumstances in any of the ways she had ever previously imagined her circumstances changing. A draft contract of perhaps 30 pages. A non-disclosure agreement. And at the back of the folder, a single photograph in a thin plastic sleeve. The photograph was small and old. Black and white. A man and a woman standing in front of a flowering tree in bright sunlight. The woman was holding a small basket, and the man had one hand at his side and the other slightly raised, gesturing towards something out of frame. They were both smiling in the small, composed way people had smiled for photographs in that era, when smiling for a camera had been a deliberate choice that took effort. The woman was Rosa. The man, much younger than in any other image Marisol had ever seen of anyone resembling him, was unmistakably Cecil Harlow. The photograph itself was not the same as the one Marisol had taken from Rosa's shelf, the one of Rosa and Consuelo by a different flowering tree on a different afternoon. This was a different photograph entirely, taken at this property, with the corner of the original porch visible at the far edge of the frame. It had been taken at some point in the mid-1960s by Marisol's best guess, when Rosa had been in her 30s and Harlow had been in his middle 50s. On the back of the photograph, in careful handwriting that was not Rosa's and not Harlow's, someone had written a date and a location and the word delivered. Marisol stood at the kitchen table and looked at the photograph for a long time. North Slope Holdings, or somebody connected to them, had been close enough to Cecil Harlow at some point in his life to obtain or take this photograph of him and Rosa together. They had kept it for over 60 years. They had given it to her now, this morning, as a quiet way of letting her know that whatever she thought she was holding on to, they had been holding on to their own piece of it for longer than she had been alive. The word delivered had been written deliberately. It was meant to be read. She thought about what the photograph was actually saying. It was saying we have been watching this property since before you were born. It was saying we know more about its history than you do. It was saying the people you have inherited from were not entirely unknown to us, even in the years when they thought they were entirely private. It was saying we are patient, and we are organized, and we have institutional memory that spans 3 generations of our leadership, and you are now the most recent person to stand between us and what we believe is here. It was not, she noted, a threat. It was something more careful than a threat. It was a position statement. She set the photograph face down on the kitchen table. She picked up the prepaid phone. She called Gerald Hatch. He picked up on the second ring. She told him, briefly, what Marsh had said and what was in the folder. She told him about the photograph. She kept her voice level, because she had learned a long time ago that staying level was the most useful thing a person in her position could do, and because she did not want Cora, who would be home from school in 5 hours, to find her mother in any state other than the state Cora was used to. Hatch was quiet for several seconds. Ms. Vega, he said, I am going to ask Eleanor Krishnan to move up her visit if she can. I will call her in the next 10 minutes. I do not want to alarm you, but I think the situation is going to begin moving faster than we had assumed. I want our people on the ground as soon as possible. Tomorrow if she can do it. Today if she can do it. Yes, said Marisol. Please. I am also, said Hatch, going to come back out there this afternoon. I would like to walk the property with you in daylight and look at the security situation. We may need to make some arrangements I had not initially anticipated needing to make. Yes, said Marisol. Are you all right? I am all right, said Marisol. I am going to be all right. I believe you, said Hatch. After they hung up, she stood for a long time at the kitchen window looking out at the bare orchard and the eastern tree line and the gravel track where the SUV had been. The morning was very still. Somewhere in the orchard a crow called once, then again, then went silent. She watched her own breath fog the kitchen window and clear and fog again. She thought about Rosa walking down to the cellar alone year after year to keep a lock functional for someone who did not yet exist. She thought about Cecil Harlow at his desk in 1976 writing 19 pages of explanation in faded brown ink for a person he would never meet. She thought about her daughter on a yellow school bus halfway between here and Greer's Hollow, looking out the window at a landscape that was, by now, beginning to feel like home. She turned away from the window. She had work to do. Eleanor Krishnan arrived the following morning in a gray sedan she had driven herself from Albany, which Marisol noted and appreciated. No assistant. No second vehicle. The colleague Hatch had mentioned turned out to be a man named Foster Okafor, who was perhaps 35 and who carried a soft-sided case with leather handles and moved through the world with the contained energy of someone who spent most of his time looking at things other people had missed. They shook hands on the porch in the thin morning cold and went inside and sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and before any of them said anything substantive, Eleanor Krishnan slid a 2-page engagement letter across the table and said, "Read this carefully," and Marisol did. It said what Krishnan had told her it would say. Confidentiality, absolute, and without time limit. No disclosure of contents, condition, provenance, or location of any item to any party not expressly named within the engagement. Fee structure based on assessment services only, not contingent on any sale or transaction, which Marisol noted specifically because it meant Krishnan had no financial incentive to push her toward any particular decision. A clause at the bottom that said, in careful language, that if any item within the assessed collection was determined to be subject to a prior legal claim, whether by a government, institution, or private party, the assessor's obligation was to advise the client of that determination privately before any other disclosure. That last clause was the one Marisol sat with longest. Eleanor Krishnan watched her read it and did not hurry her. When Marisol looked up, Krishnan said, "That clause is there because it is possible, depending on what is in that room, that some items will have histories that are complicated. Not criminal, not on your part, but complicated. I want you to know that before we go down there, because I want you to understand that my job is not to alarm you. My job is to tell you what you have, clearly and completely, so that you can make informed decisions. Nothing that is in that room is your fault, and everything that is in that room is now your responsibility, and those two things can both be true at once." Marisol signed the engagement letter. Foster Okafor had brought 2 high-powered battery lanterns and a pair of cotton examination gloves which he put on before they descended. He had said very little during the kitchen conversation, but when they went through the cellar door and started down the stone steps, something in his posture changed, the way a person's posture changes when they have stopped being polite and started being serious. Marisol worked the shelving unit panel, and it swung inward, and the smell came out again, cold and dry and faintly metallic, unchanged from 3 days before. She led them down the 6 steps, and along the corridor, and to the iron-bound door. She put the key in the lock. It turned as smoothly as before. She pushed the door open. She had braced herself for the room to look different in retrospect, the way rooms sometimes did when you returned to them after the initial shock had passed, and you were seeing them with the diminished eye of familiarity. It did not look different. It looked exactly as it had the first time, the long table with its padded objects and the cabinets along the walls, and the small painting at the far end, all of it preserved in its cold, dry stillness. Eleanor Krishnan made a sound that was not a word. It was the kind of involuntary sound that a person made when something they had prepared themselves to be professional about exceeded what professional preparation could reach. She made it once, and then she was professional again, her face composing itself into the expression of someone doing work. Foster Okafor put down his lantern on the stone floor and stood very still for 5 seconds looking at the room. Then he said, quietly and with no particular inflection, as if noting something in a report, "This is real." They worked for 4 hours. Marisol stayed near the door and watched. She had understood, without needing to be told, that her role in this room was to witness rather than to handle, and that the people who knew what they were looking at needed room to look. She watched Okafor move along the table, pausing at each object, sometimes crouching to see from beneath the lantern's angle, sometimes holding a lantern very close, and then stepping back for distance. He did not touch anything with bare hands. He made notes in a small spiral pad in handwriting too compressed for her to read from where she stood. He spoke occasionally in a low voice to Krishnan, and Krishnan listened and made her own notes, and sometimes asked a question that Marisol could not hear. After 2 hours, Okafor went to the cabinets. He tried the keys from the ring, working through them methodically, and one by one the cabinet doors came open. What was inside them he examined with the same careful slowness. More notes. Marisol waited. She had become very good at waiting. At the end of 4 hours they came back to where she stood near the door, and Okafor took off one glove to shake her hand again, which was a gesture she understood as acknowledgement of the specific kind, the kind that passed between people when something significant had occurred and words were inadequate to the occasion. They went back up to the kitchen. Okafor made another coffee without being asked, moving around the kitchen with the ease of someone who had learned that practical acts were useful in moments like this one. Krishnan sat at the table and looked at her notes for a moment, and then she looked at Marisol. "I want to be systematic," she said. "I want to tell you what we found, and I want you to ask questions as I go rather than waiting for the end, because this is a great deal to take in, and I do not want you sitting with any confusion longer than you need to." "All right," said Marisol. Krishnan opened her notebook. "There are 48 discrete objects on the central table," she said. "Of those, I can identify with reasonable confidence the period and region of origin for 31. 8 more require additional examination and possibly laboratory analysis before I could speak to provenance. The remaining 9 are either outside my specific expertise or are ambiguous enough that I would not want to characterize them without bringing in additional specialists." Marisol nodded. "Of the 31 I can speak to," said Krishnan, "the majority are consistent with what I would call significant private collection material from the mid-20th century. Objects that were acquired legally, in an era when legal acquisition meant something different than it does now, from sources in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and North America. Several items are consistent with collections that were dispersed during and after the Second World War. That is the complication I mentioned in the engagement letter. Not a legal problem for you, necessarily, but a historical complexity that will need to be handled with care." "What does that mean specifically?" said Marisol. "It means," said Krishnan, "that some of what is in that room may have documentation questions that require research before they can be cleanly transacted. It means there are organizations and databases that track displaced cultural property, and that responsible stewardship of this collection includes checking against those databases before making any decisions about disposition." "I understand." "Good. I want to move now to the things that are not complicated in that way, because there are items in that room that are straightforwardly, cleanly, and extraordinarily valuable, and I want you to understand the scale of what you are holding. Marisol put both hands flat on the table. She kept her face still. The jade carving on the third stand from the north end of the table, said Krishnan, is a Song dynasty piece. Late 11th century, most probably. I have seen 3 comparable pieces in the last 20 years of my practice. One sold at Christie's Hong Kong 7 years ago for $2.4 million. One was donated by a private collector to the Metropolitan Museum, where it is currently on display. The third was acquired by a private buyer at a figure I was not disclosed. That is one object. Marisol did not move. The manuscript pages under glass, said Krishnan, are genuine. I will not speculate on their full provenance until Foster has completed his own examination, but based on the script, the pigment work, and the gold leaf application I observed, at minimum one of the 2 pages originated from a significant medieval production center in northern France. I would not put a number on it today, but I would not put a number below 7 figures. That is 2 objects. Okafor set down his coffee and said, without looking up from his notebook, the bronze on stand 7 is Roman. 1st century, almost certainly not reproduction. Condition is exceptional. Krishna nodded. There are 4 other bronzes of similar or lesser significance, she said. There are 11 items in the cabinets. 8 of those are bound volumes of which I recognized 2 on site. One is an early printed book that should not exist outside of a cataloged institution, and yet it does. There are also 3 items in the cabinets that are wrapped in original cloth that I did not unwrap today, because I want proper documentation before anything is touched further. Marisol said, slowly, the painting on the back wall. Yes, said Krishnan. There was a small pause. That is why I told you on the phone that Foster and I might react strongly to what we saw, said Krishnan. I want to be careful in how I describe what I believe I am looking at, because I have been careful for 26 years, and I do not intend to stop being careful now. What I can tell you with confidence is this. The subject matter, the panel dimensions, the ground preparation visible at the edge, and the quality of the brushwork are all consistent with the hand and the period and the documented working method of a specific Dutch master whose work has not appeared on any public market in over 80 years. Marisol looked at her. I am not going to say the name out loud, said Krishnan, until I have physical analysis. What I will say is that if my assessment is correct, and I want to be measured in how I phrase this, the painting on that wall is among the most significant private discoveries of this century. And I will say, further, that it is in condition that I would not have predicted possible for a work of that age. Whoever maintained that room understood preservation, even if they did not know precisely what they were preserving. Rosa had known, Marisol thought. Rosa had known enough to keep the air dry and the room sealed and the lock oiled. Rosa had known because Harlow had told her, in whatever conversations had passed between them over 17 years and in whatever he had written in those 19 pages. Rosa had not needed to understand exactly what the painting was. She had needed to understand that it was important and that it required cold and darkness and silence, and no one knowing it was there. That was enough, Marisol said, almost to herself. Krishnan looked at her. Rosa, said Marisol. She kept the room. She kept it exactly right. Yes, said Krishnan, after a moment. She did. They sat for a while in the kitchen without anyone speaking. Outside, a crow called from the orchard. The wind had picked up since morning and was moving through the bare branches along the eastern tree-line with a sound like water. Marisol thought about the 3rd list she had made the night of Marsh's first visit. The list of things she was not going to do. She was not going to sell anything quickly. She was not going to act under pressure. She was not going to let fear make her decisions. She picked up the prepaid phone and called Gerald Hatch and asked him to come out that afternoon. Quentin Marsh called at 2 o'clock, while Hatch was still on the porch drinking tea and going through Krishnan's preliminary notes. Marisol answered and heard the same friendly voice, slightly more contained than before. I wanted to follow up on the materials I left, he said. I hope they were helpful. I've looked at them, she said. And I appreciate you being direct about your interest, she said. I'd like to be direct back. I'm not in a position to have a substantive conversation about the property right now. I'm still in the process of understanding what I have. Of course, that's completely reasonable. I just want you to know that the offer in that folder is a floor, not a ceiling. When you're ready to talk, we're prepared to go considerably higher. How considerably, said Marisol. He named a number. It was a large number. It was the kind of number that would have changed, in any of the ways she had previously imagined change, everything about the life she had been living. It would have paid off any debt she had ever carried and set Cora through college and bought a house in whatever city they chose and left enough remaining to stop worrying about money in the way she had been worrying about money since she was old enough to understand what money meant. She had understood, sitting in the kitchen the morning after she found the room, that the contents of that room represented a different order of value than this number. She did not say so. She said, "I'll keep that in mind." She hung up and looked at Hatch. "He gave me a number," she said, and told him what it was. Hatch nodded once. He did not look surprised. "That number," he said, "is less than the jade carving." "I know," said Marisol. "He knows you found it. Or he suspects I've found it, and he's testing what I'll say." "What are you going to do?" said Hatch. "What Rosa did," said Marisol. "I'm going to take my time." Hatch looked at her with the particular expression she had come to understand meant he was deciding whether to say something. He said it. "Ms. Vega, I want to speak plainly to you about something, and I want you to understand it comes from an obligation I feel to this situation and not from any desire to manage you or tell you what to do. Go ahead." Rosa kept that room for 60 years. She lived in it, in a cottage behind the house that held what she was protecting, with nothing but patience and a strong sense of what was owed. The contents of that room could have changed her life in the same way they could change yours. She chose not to do that. She chose to keep it for whoever came after. "I know," said Marisol. "I am not telling you what to do with it. That is entirely your decision, and you're right. I am telling you that you have a choice Rosa did not have. She was protecting something on behalf of a man who trusted her. You are the inheritor of that protection, but you are also free, in a way Rosa never was, to decide what it is for." Marisol looked at the table. "I've thought about that," she said. "I've been thinking about it since I read the notebook the first time. What Rosa would have done. And Rosa would have been practical about it," Marisol said. "She wasn't keeping it out of reverence for the things themselves. She was keeping it because she gave her word. Once the obligation was fulfilled, which it was when she put it in the will, the things became what they were. Objects. Things that could be used." Hatch nodded. "What can they be used for?" said Marisol. "What do you actually do with something like this?" Hatch folded his hands on his knee. "You have several options," he said. "You can sell outright, to private buyers or at auction, which for certain items would generate sums that would fund several lifetimes. You could donate all or part of the collection to an institution, which would generate significant tax consequences and considerable public recognition, neither of which you may want. You could loan items to institutions while retaining ownership, which generates neither income nor recognition, but preserves your ownership and your options. Or you could establish a foundation or private trust, which would allow you to make structured decisions over time rather than all at once, and which would provide a legal structure that protects both you and the collection from the kind of pressure North Slope is applying." "That last one," said Marisol. Hatch nodded once. "It takes time to set up," he said. "Several months, perhaps, to do it properly. During that time you are in the same position you are in now, which is that the collection is yours but is not yet formally structured in a way that provides institutional protection. Can we make the room more secure in the meantime?" "Dennis," said Hatch. "His nephew." "Yes. He can do that without asking questions about why. I'll call him tomorrow." "There's one more thing," said Marisol. "The items with documentation questions. The displaced property. Krishnan mentioned that." "Yes. I want to deal with those properly, before anything else is decided. Whatever those items are and wherever they came from, I want to know, and I want to make the right decisions about them, even if those decisions cost money." Hatch looked at her. "That is going to be noticed," he said. "Not widely, but in certain circles, people who track this kind of research, the appearance of unprovenanced material with those kinds of questions tends to generate attention." "I know. That's all right. You understand that it may result in some items leaving the collection with no financial return to you." "I understand." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a formality that she understood was his way of expressing something that was not formal at all, "Rosa was right about you." Marisol did. "Professional judgment," he said. "It is consistent with the work of the painter in question in every particular I can assess without laboratory analysis. The style, the ground, the wear pattern, the craquelure, the way the underdrawing shows through the paint in places I was able to examine. All of it is consistent. I have examined several authenticated works by this artist in major institutions in the last 20 years. This is consistent with all of them, and there is no record in any catalog of this work existing. What does that mean? It means, he said, that if the physical analysis confirms what I believe I am looking at, we are not dealing with a work that went missing. We are dealing with a work that was never publicly known to exist, which is a very different and, from a legal standpoint, considerably cleaner situation. He finished the water and set the glass down. I will need to consult with colleagues before I say more, he said, but I wanted you to know that. Marisol thanked him, and he went out to his car, and she sat at the table after they had all left and listened to the house settle around her in the January cold. A week into February, Brower called. Of the 7 items she had flagged, 3 had come back clean, 1 remained inconclusive, and 3 had register matches. The 3 matches were a bronze oil lamp, a small carved ivory figure, and one of the leather-bound volumes. The ivory figure had documentation in a French archive consistent with a collection that had been seized in Paris in 1942. The bronze and the volume had less definitive histories, but enough to warrant disclosure. What do I need to do? Said Marisol. Brower had a list. It was precise and procedural and not alarming in its specifics, though it required the kind of attention that Marisol had always been capable of bringing to things that required it. There were organizations to contact. There was paperwork to file. There was a process, established and known, for voluntary disclosure of this kind. And that process existed precisely because there were people who chose to engage it rather than pretend the questions did not exist. She engaged it. The olive lamp and the volume were returned to the organizations that had filed claims on them, with documentation and correspondence that Brower handled on her behalf. The ivory figure had a more complicated path, the French archive having no living claimant, and the matter requiring a determination from an international body that took 4 months and produced a conclusion she had not expected. The figure was to be transferred to a French national collection, with Marisol receiving a formal acknowledgement of voluntary disclosure and a corresponding certification that the remainder of the collection carried no outstanding claims from the same archive. She attended the handover in a conference room in Albany with Hatch beside her. The representatives from the French organization were formal and appreciative and said something to her, in the particular careful tone of institutional gratitude, that she wrote down afterward in the spiral notebook she had begun keeping for this purpose. They said, "This kind of voluntary action is rarer than it should be, and it matters more than any monetary value." She wrote it down because she thought she would want to read it on a day when the practicalities of the situation made it difficult to remember why the right decision was still the right decision. In March, with the snow still heavy on the eastern fields and the creek running high along the property boundary, Eleanor Krishnan completed the formal assessment report. She sent it to Marisol's email rather than by post because it was long and she did not want it traveling in an envelope through a rural post office with no tracking. Marisol printed it at the Greer's Hollow Library on a Tuesday morning, 63 pages, including supporting documentation, and read it at the kitchen table over 2 evenings. She called her grandmother on the 3rd evening, not to tell her about the report, but because she had been putting the call off for too long and the putting off had begun to cost her something. Abuela Consuelo answered on the 3rd ring, as she always did, with the particular alertness of a woman who had spent 90 years deciding that alertness was worth maintaining. Marisol spoke for a long time. She told her grandmother about the house. She told her about Rosa's small room and the photograph of the 2 sisters by the flowering tree, and she heard her grandmother go very quiet on the other end. She told her about the notebook and about what Harlow had written. She did not tell her about the specific contents of the room, because those details were still held within the engagement agreement. But she told her grandmother enough that the older woman could understand the shape of what had been bequeathed. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then Abuela Consuelo said, in the voice she used when she was not going to be sentimental and was fighting the impulse anyway, "Rosa always kept her word. I didn't know she was doing any of this. We lost touch so long ago, but I'm not surprised. She was always the one who kept her word. I know, Grandma. She picked you because she could find you. She was always sharp. She was 91 and doing internet research to find the right person." Consuelo made a sound that was half laugh and half something else. "That sounds like her," she said. They talked for another hour about other things, the cousins' children and the weather in Salinas and what Cora was reading, The comfortable territory of a weekly call, except that the call felt different now, weighted with something it had not carried before, the specific weight of a family that had lost its connective threads and found one of them again after decades. Before they hung up, Marisol said, "I want to bring Cora out to see you this summer. When the work on the house has settled some. I want that too." Not answer immediately. She looked out the kitchen window at the orchard and the eastern treeline. "She was better than right," Marisol said. She was optimistic. "But I intend to make her right." The school bus came down the county road at 3:40 and Cora was the first one off it, the way she usually was, moving quickly down the gravel track with her backpack bouncing and her face already doing the calculation of whether there was anything worth reporting about the day. Marisol met her at the bottom of the track and took her hand, and they walked up together. "There was a lady from Albany here today," Marisol said. "What kind of lady?" "An expert in old things." "What did she say?" "She said we have something valuable." Cora looked up at her. "How valuable?" Marisol thought about how to answer this honestly for an 8-year-old. "More valuable than I expected," she said. "Enough that we're going to have to make careful decisions about it for a long time. Are we going to sell it?" "Some things, maybe. Some things we're going to give back to the right places. Some things we're going to keep." Cora absorbed this. "Can I keep my room when we fix the house?" she said. She had picked a room. Of course she had. On the second floor, she had told Marisol in the first days. The room with the window that looked toward the orchard, the one where the afternoon light came in long and flat across the floor. "That room is yours," Marisol said. Cora nodded and went ahead up the porch steps and into the house, and Marisol followed her. Over the following weeks, the property began to change at the rate of sustained work, which was to say slowly and in ways visible mainly to the person doing the work. Dennis came twice a week and worked without conversation on the most pressing structural items. The northwest window opening got a proper frame and new glass before the worst of winter arrived. The collapsed porch sections were cleared and the sound sections reinforced, and Dennis found a load of matching lumber in the salvage yard 2 towns over and said he could rebuild the collapsed sections in the spring if she wanted them to match. She said she did. She borrowed the computer at the Greer's Harlow Library on Tuesday mornings to research North Slope holdings and found what she had expected to find, which was a paper corporation with addresses in 3 states and a website that said very little and a directory of principals that included a Quentin Marsh Sr. and a Quentin Marsh II before the current one. 3 generations of the same name pursuing the same objective with the patience of people who had been told, at some point, that patience was the right strategy. She found no public record of what had told them that. She found one reference in a digitized county historical newsletter from 1969 that mentioned a local businessman interested in the Harlow property and described him as having prior business dealings with the estate's deceased owner. That was all. Whatever Harlow had let slip, or whatever someone close to him had let slip, it had been enough to pass down 3 generations as institutional conviction. She thought about what it would take to maintain that kind of organizational memory across 60 years, and she thought about what Rosa had maintained across the same period on the other side of it, and the comparison did not favor North Slope. Marsh called twice more in December. She answered both times and said the same thing. She was still assessing her situation. She would be in touch when she was ready. She thanked him for his patience. His voice each time was smooth and entirely opaque, the voice of someone who had learned to treat patience as a tactic rather than a quality. She did not tell him anything. She did not confirm that Krishnan had visited. She did not confirm or deny the existence of anything in the house beyond what was visible to the eye. She said the minimum required to keep the conversation civil and ended the calls without hurrying. In January, Krishnan came back with 2 additional colleagues, a Providence researcher named Adeline Brower who had worked with the Art Loss Register for a decade and who spoke to Marisol in the kitchen for 2 hours before going down to the chamber, and a conservation specialist whose name Marisol did not write down because he asked her not to, for reasons he explained in terms she understood as professional rather than personal. They were down in the room for 6 hours. When they came up, Brower sat at the kitchen table with Marisol and said, "Of the 48 objects, I have preliminary concerns about 7. Not certainties. Concerns. We need to do register checks and archive research, which will take several weeks and which I will conduct from my office. I will report back to you directly before taking any other action. That is all I need to know right now," said Marisol. Brower looked at her. "You're not going to ask which 7. I'll know when you tell me. Knowing now doesn't help me do anything useful. Tell me when you have something actionable. Brower nodded, once, with the nod of someone who had expected a different conversation and found this one more efficient. The conservation specialist had taken the painting down from the wall, very carefully, and examined it under portable ultraviolet lighting and with a magnifying glass the size of his palm for over an hour before he put it back exactly where it had been, and then he had stood in front of it for another 10 minutes without moving. When he came up to the kitchen, he poured himself a glass of water and drank half of it before he said anything. He said, "There will need to be physical analysis. Dendrochronology on the panel. Pigment sampling with appropriate consultation. It will take time." "Is it what she thought it was?" said Marisol. He looked at the glass in his hand. "I want to answer that very carefully," he said. "Answer it however you need to." He looked at the glass for another moment, and then at her. "In my," said Consuelo, "and I want to bring you the photograph." There was a long pause. "Yes," said her grandmother. "Bring me the photograph." The legal work on the foundation took 3 months. Hatch and a colleague in Albany built it carefully, the kind of structure that was designed to hold things for a long time without requiring constant maintenance, which was appropriate given what it was built to hold. The foundation was named, after some thought, for the 2 women who had made it possible. The name was simple and in Spanish, and Marisol chose it without consulting anyone. La palabra dada, the given word. She did not explain the name publicly because there was no public at this stage. The foundation was a legal entity in the state of New York, filed quietly, with Marisol as executive director and Hatch's legal counsel and 1 seat on the board that she left open, provisionally, for whoever she decided it should belong to. Quentin Marsh did not call in April. He had not called since February, when she had finally told him, in terms she had chosen carefully, that she had engaged professional assistance in assessing the collection and that any future contact regarding the property should be directed to her attorney. He had been quiet after that. Whatever intelligence North Slope had developed over 3 generations about the Harlow property, they had apparently not developed the ability to act on it without a willing seller, and she was not willing. On a morning in late April, with the fields around the property beginning to turn green and the orchard showing its first blossoms of the season, Marisol stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the land that was hers. The porch had been rebuilt in matching lumber. The northwest window caught the morning light correctly now, the glass bright in its repaired frame. Dennis had found a mason who could work in field stone, and the east chimney had been repaired from the fallen heap below it. The new courses of stone set in with the old ones in a way that would have been visible to an expert and was invisible to anyone else. The grounds were still largely wild, the formal gardens gone past recovery without major work, but there was something in the wildness of them that did not feel like failure. It felt like the property had settled into what it actually was, a place that had been patient for a very long time and was willing to be patient a little longer. Cora was at school. She had been at school in Greer's Hollow for 5 months now, and she had the ease in her movements that came from knowing a place, the ease of a child who knew which teacher to go to for geology books and which way to walk to the library from her classroom, and the name of every horse in the barn at her friend Waverly's family's property 2 miles down the county road. She had grown, Marisol thought, in ways that were harder to measure than height. The painting had gone to a laboratory in the Netherlands in February, accompanied by documentation and photographs and a formal request for dendrochronological and pigment analysis, filed under the foundation's name. The conservation specialist had corresponded with 2 colleagues there whose names he trusted. Marisol had received an acknowledgement of receipt and had been told the process would take 6 to 8 months. She had noted the timeline in her spiral notebook and set it aside. She was not impatient about it. She had spent the better part of her adult life doing the right thing on a timeline determined by the situation rather than by her preference, and this was no different. The Greer's Hollow Medical Center had taken her on in January as a part-time per diem CNA, 2 days a week, which was not a great deal of income, but was income from work she was good at and work that required her to be in town, among people, doing something concrete and human-scaled in a period of her life that was otherwise full of abstractions. The nurses there had the same quality she had always found in hospital nurses, the kind of unsentimental steadiness that came from doing necessary work without the option of stopping when it became difficult. She liked them and they liked her, in the plain reciprocal way that people who were good at work liked others who were also good at work. On the morning of the last day of April, she sat at the kitchen table and opened the spiral notebook and read through it from the beginning. She had been keeping it since January, and it was nearly full. It held lists and contact information and dates and the notes from Brower's calls and the names of the organizations the returned items had gone to, and a page near the back where she had written, in her small, precise handwriting, everything she could remember Rosa saying in the journal entries. The last entry she had written in the notebook, 2 nights before, was not a list or a record. She had written it at midnight in the small room behind the kitchen, the room she was still sleeping in because the second floor of the main house was not yet habitable, with Cora's breathing slow beside her and the wood stove burning down to coals and the property very still outside. She had written, I think about Rosa every day, not abstractly, concretely. What it felt like to be in this room by herself for 60 years, tending something she believed in because a man she trusted had believed in her. I understand the choice. I didn't expect to, but I do. There is a particular freedom in organizing your life around an obligation you have accepted completely. The obligation doesn't feel like a limit. It feels like a structure you can stand inside without being afraid of falling. She had also written, below that, in a slightly different hand as if it had come to her later, I think that is what I have been doing my whole life. I didn't know that was what I was doing, but I think it is the same thing. She closed the notebook. She put on her coat and went out to the porch and stood looking at the orchard in the morning light. The blossoms were white against the gray-brown branches, delicate in the way of things that were early in a season, not yet certain of the warmth, still carrying the memory of winter in the set of the branches beneath them. A crow moved through the orchard in a low line and settled in the topmost branch of the tallest tree and sat there looking out over the property with the proprietary calm of an animal that had been here longer than any of the recent changes and expected to be here after them. She thought about Cora's question in the kitchen the morning after they found the room. Are we rich now? She had not known how to answer it then. She thought she knew how now. They had always been rich in the things that mattered, which was not a sentiment, but a fact. They had been rich in the specific way of people who were capable, which was to say that they had always been able to do the next necessary thing without falling apart in the attempt. Cora was rich in the way of a child who had been given, early and consistently, the experience of watching her mother take care of difficult things without pretending they were easy, which was the most useful thing a child could be given. Marisol was rich in the specific way that came from having kept her own word to herself through circumstances that had not made it easy. Now they had something else as well, something that would require care for the rest of Marisol's life and beyond, and that would demand the same qualities it had always demanded from those entrusted with it, patience and steadiness and the willingness to make the right decision when the easier decision was available. She had been made for exactly this. That was not vanity. It was the plain recognition that the woman who had gone to New York at 22 with a duffel bag and the conviction that a life could be built from scratch had been building toward this without knowing what it was. She had been building the person that Rosa had found when she went looking. The crow called once from the top of the orchard tree and then was quiet. Marisol went back inside. She made tea. She set Cora's cereal out on the table and folded a napkin beside it in the way her daughter liked, which was square and precise, a preference Cora had had since she was old enough to notice such things. She boiled 2 eggs and put them in the egg cups she had bought at the thrift store in Greer's Hollow, the ones with the small chipped base that she had been meaning to replace for 3 months and never had because she had become accustomed to them. She heard Cora's feet on the floor of the small room, the deliberate sequence of a child waking in the way she had always woken, slowly and with reconnaissance. She heard the door open. She heard her daughter's footsteps come down the passage toward the kitchen. She heard Cora stop in the kitchen doorway, the way she always stopped, doing her morning accounting of the room, checking that things were where they should be and that the day was beginning in a recognizable shape. "Good morning," said Marisol. "Good morning," said Cora. She came to the table and sat down and looked at the egg cup and the folded napkin and the cereal waiting in its bowl. And then she looked at her mother with the expression she had when things were in the right order, a look that was not quite a smile and was more than contentment, a look that was the face of someone who had found the world, on this particular morning, to be approximately what it should be. Marisol sat down across from her. The light came through the kitchen window in the flat gold of a late April morning and fell across the kitchen table and lay there. They ate breakfast together in the stone house that had been waiting for them, in the ordinary way of people who had found the place where they belonged. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.